The courthouse stood like an aging sentinel in the heart of Atlanta, its grand stone pillars worn by time and history. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and the quiet hum of murmured conversations. The courtroom itself, with its polished mahogany benches and towering windows, had witnessed decades of verdicts, some just, others anything but. But today was different. Today, the truth was a fragile thing, teetering on the edge of being buried beneath the weight of a lie. Officer Derek Callaway sat at the plaintiff's table, exuding the confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences. His uniform was pristine, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights, a picture-perfect emblem of law and order. He knew how this would go. He had done it before. He had played this role flawlessly, standing as the unwavering enforcer of justice. And across the room, Olivia Carter sat at the defense table, still as stone. The 38-year-old woman's deep brown skin glowed under the harsh courtroom lighting, her dark eyes unreadable. She did not fidget, she did not shift in her seat. She simply sat, her posture impossibly straight, her hands resting lightly on the polished wood before her. To the untrained eye, she appeared passive, defeated even. But those who looked closer, those who truly saw her, recognized the quiet storm beneath the surface. Callaway's voice rang out, smooth, practiced. When I arrived at the scene, the defendant was acting erratically. I asked for identification, and she refused. She became hostile, violent even. She struck me and reached for my service weapon, forcing me to act in self-defense. The gallery murmured. A few exchanged knowing glances, and still, Olivia did not move. She was waiting. Because today, the truth would finally be heard. The weight of the accusation settled over the courtroom like a thick fog, pressing down on every spectator, every juror, every unseen presence that lingered between the towering wooden walls. The air was heavy with unspoken biases, quiet judgments passed without words, and yet, Olivia Carter remained unmoved. She sat at the defense table with an almost unsettling calm, her posture so perfectly poised it was as if she had been carved from stone. Her expression was unreadable, no flinch, no trace of fear. There was no desperation in her eyes, no plea for understanding. If anything, she looked patient. That patience unnerved people. Across the room, Officer Derek Callaway leaned back in his chair, that same cocky smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He was used to this, controlling the narrative, twisting the truth just enough to make it seem irrefutable. He had done this before. The system had always worked in his favor. But something about Olivia unsettled him. She didn't react the way he expected. No shaking hands, no pleading eyes, no frantic glances at her attorney, praying for a lifeline. Instead, she simply sat there, her dark brown eyes locked onto his with an unnerving intensity. She wasn't just looking at him, she was studying him. Nathaniel Vaughn, her young but razor-sharp attorney, noticed it too. He had walked into this trial knowing they were fighting an uphill battle. He was fresh out of law school, a public defender up against a seasoned officer with years of credibility built into his badge. But when he turned to Olivia and saw the quiet power in her stillness, he felt something shift. She wasn't afraid, she was waiting. And when she finally spoke, the entire courtroom would feel it. Nathaniel Vaughn wasn't a stranger to pressure. At 28, fresh-faced and ambitious, he had walked into this courtroom knowing he was the underdog. He was going up against seasoned prosecutors, a jury that likely leaned in favor of law enforcement, and a police officer who had mastered the art of spinning lies into gospel truth. But as he sat beside Olivia Carter, he had an epiphany. This wasn't an ordinary case, and she wasn't an ordinary defendant. Nathaniel adjusted his tie, stealing another glance at Olivia. She was infuriatingly composed, like a queen sitting on her throne while everyone else scrambled around in chaos. Not once had she leaned over to whisper frantic instructions in his ear. Not once had she looked at him with the desperation he had grown used to seeing from clients who knew the odds were stacked against them. Instead, she sat there, still, waiting. Across the room, Callaway lounged in his chair like a man who had already won. His boots were polished to a mirror shine, his badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and his smirk was as obnoxious as it was premature. Nathaniel felt an itch in the back of his mind, a feeling he couldn't shake. Then Olivia did something that made his breath hitch. She looked at Callaway, really looked at him. Not with anger, not with fear, but with calculation. Nathaniel recognized that look. He had seen it once before on his brother's face during an intense poker game when he was about to wipe the table clean. Oh, damn, Olivia Carter wasn't nervous because she knew something no one else did. This wasn't a woman backed into a corner. This was a woman setting the trap. And Callaway, he was about to walk right into it. Nathaniel Vaughn rose slowly, smoothing out his jacket like he had all the time in the world. He wasn't rushing, no need to. The courtroom was already thick with anticipation, the jury leaning forward just slightly, waiting to see what this young lawyer was about to do. He turned to Officer Derek Callaway, who sat in the witness stand, his usual smug confidence radiating off him like cheap cologne. Nathaniel had seen men like him before, the kind who had never been questioned, never been challenged, and certainly never expected their version of the truth to be picked apart in front of a live audience. Officer Callaway, Nathaniel began, his voice smooth, almost casual. You testified just now that my client, Miss Carter, was aggressive when you approached her, correct? Yes, you said she raised her voice. Yes, you said she struck you. Yes, Nathaniel lifted an eyebrow, tilting his head slightly. And yet, somehow, you were the only one who left this altercation with injuries? A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Callaway's jaw twitched, but he didn't flinch. Sometimes injuries aren't visible right away, he said, his voice flat. Nathaniel feigned a look of understanding. Ah, I see. So you were injured. I didn't say that. Nathaniel's lips curved just slightly. So you weren't injured. Callaway hesitated just for a second. A fraction of a second too long, and in that moment, Nathaniel knew. Got you. His smile sharpened as he reached into his briefcase. Your Honor, I'd like to submit a video recording into evidence. The courtroom snapped. Callaway stiffened. His hands gripped the arms of his chair a little tighter. Nathaniel turned back to him, his voice quiet, almost amused. That's what you said happened, isn't it? Callaway didn't answer. Nathaniel looked toward the jury, his voice filled with confidence. Let's roll the tape. The room felt like it had stopped breathing. Even the dust floating in the air seemed to pause, waiting. Nathaniel Vaughn stepped back, giving the courtroom a moment to soak in what was about to happen. He could feel the energy shift, the jury, the spectators, even the judge, all leaning just a little closer, their curiosity turning into something sharper. Across the room, Officer Derek Callaway sat unnaturally still, his polished boots suddenly looking less like a badge of honor and more like a desperate attempt to hold on to control. Nathaniel turned to the bailiff. Please play the recording. The screen flickered to life. The grainy footage showed exactly what Callaway claimed had happened, except for one tiny detail. None of it was true. There was no aggression from Olivia Carter, no raised voice, no sudden attack. Instead, it showed Callaway grabbing Olivia's wrist first, yanking her without cause. Her stance remained firm, her face calm, her mouth forming words that, unlike Callaway's testimony, were now undeniable truth. The room exploded into murmurs. Someone gasped. A reporter furiously scribbled notes, pen scratching against paper like it was trying to keep up with history in the making. Callaway's smirk was gone, completely. Nathaniel turned slowly, giving the officer a moment to absorb the sinking realization that his carefully crafted lie had just been obliterated in high definition. Then, as if savoring the moment, Nathaniel walked toward the witness stand, his voice smooth and deliberate. Officer Callaway, he said, tilting his head just slightly, his smile never quite reaching his eyes, would you like to explain? Or would you prefer to plead the fifth silence? Callaway's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. And for the first time since this trial began, he looked afraid. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. The video had said everything. Callaway's lie had unraveled in real time, and the weight of that realization hung in the air like an anvil waiting to drop. But Nathaniel Vaughn wasn't done yet. He turned back to Olivia Carter, who had barely moved since the trial began. She sat at the defense table, poised, collected, unshaken. She had been waiting for this moment. Nathaniel adjusted his cuffs and strode toward the stand. "Miss Carter," he said, voice smooth as silk, "I think it's time the jury knows exactly who you are." Finally, Olivia stood, and when she did, the energy in the room shifted. Gone was the quiet observer sitting patiently in her chair. She commanded the space now, her presence as solid and immovable as steel. She stepped toward the microphone, adjusting it with slow precision, before finally locking eyes with the jury. "My name is Lieutenant Commander Olivia Carter." A ripple of shock swept through the courtroom. Someone in the back gasped. Even Judge Lawson's gavel hovered in the air, suspended mid-motion. Nathaniel smiled to himself. "There it is. I am a retired Navy SEAL. I served this country for 20 years, deploying into some of the most dangerous combat zones in the world. I have trained in high-pressure combat scenarios, counterterrorism operations, and hostage rescue missions." The jury was stunned. Even Callaway, who had been gripping the witness stand like it was the last life raft on a sinking ship, looked frozen. Nathaniel turned, letting the words settle. "This," he said, gesturing toward Olivia, "is the woman Officer Callaway claimed was a threat." And suddenly, the entire courtroom saw the truth not just in the video, but in her. The power dynamic had just flipped, and Callaway, he was done. The courtroom wasn't just heavy, it was charged. The kind of energy that crackled in the air right before a thunderstorm. The kind that made people hold their breath without realizing it. Because this wasn't just about Olivia Carter anymore. This was about the system. Nathaniel Vaughn knew it. The jury knew it. Hell, even Judge Lawson, who had spent decades on the bench, rubbing his temples over 1,000 cases just like this, knew it. Olivia's revelation, as a Navy SEAL, had shattered the illusion Callaway had so carefully crafted. But now, Nathaniel wasn't just prosecuting one corrupt cop. He was indicting an entire system that let people like Callaway thrive. Nathaniel turned, his sharp gaze landing back on the officer in the witness stand. "Tell me, Officer Callaway," he said, his voice dangerously smooth, "how many times have you testified in cases like this?" Callaway's fingers curled against the stand. "Objection," the prosecutor started. Nathaniel didn't even flinch. "Your Honor, I'm establishing a pattern." Judge Lawson exhaled. "I'll allow it. Proceed." Nathaniel smiled like he'd just won the lottery. "I'll ask again. How many times have you testified against defendants like my client?" Callaway's jaw tightened. I don't keep count." Nathaniel stepped forward, voice steady. "No." "Because we do." He turned to the jury, letting the moment breathe. "Records show that in the past 5 years, Officer Callaway has arrested over 30 black defendants, all charged with resisting arrest." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Nathaniel leaned in. 30 times, officer. Either you're the unluckiest cop in America or this is a pattern." Callaway didn't answer. He didn't have to. Because now, it wasn't just his credibility on trial. It was the whole damn system. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. 12 strangers, men and women from different walks of life, sat in the jury box, their expressions tight, their hands folded in their laps. They had been given the truth. Now, it was up to them to decide what to do with it. Nathaniel Vaughn drummed his fingers against the defense table, a rhythm he didn't realize he was tapping. He had done everything, laid out the facts, shattered Callaway's credibility, and exposed the system for what it was. Now, all he could do was wait. Beside him, Olivia Carter hadn't moved. She didn't fidget. She didn't steal anxious glances at the jury. She sat as she always did, calm, composed, unreadable. The waiting stretched longer than it should have. And then finally the bailiff stepped forward. "The jury has reached a verdict." The courtroom shifted, people leaning forward, journalists gripping their pens, the weight of the moment pressing in. Judge Lawson gave a curt nod. "Proceed." The forewoman, a middle-aged woman with silver-streaked hair and a firm gaze, stood and cleared her throat. We find the defendant. A pause, one fraction of a second that stretched into eternity. Not guilty on all charges. For a beat just one, the courtroom was silent. Then, like a dam breaking, the air was filled with gasps, murmurs, and exhale of disbelief. Somewhere in the back, someone let out a quiet, triumphant yes. Callaway's face drained of color. Nathaniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. And Olivia Carter, she didn't smile. She just breathed, because for once, just this once, justice had won. The echoes of the gavel had barely faded when Olivia Carter stood from her seat. She moved with the same deliberate grace she had carried throughout the trial, steady, unshaken, unbreakable. The weight of the moment pressed down on the room, but she carried it with ease, as if she had prepared for this moment her entire life. Nathaniel Vaughn expected her to smile, maybe even celebrate. After all, they had won. But Olivia didn't gloat, didn't bask in the victory. Instead, she turned and walked right past Callaway without a second glance, because this wasn't just about winning a case, it was about changing the game. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed like a storm, microphones thrust forward, cameras flashing. "Miss Carter, how do you feel about today's verdict? What will you do next? Do you think Officer Callaway should be prosecuted?" Olivia raised a hand, not in dismissal, not in victory, but in control. The crowd stilled. "This isn't just my story," she said, her voice strong, unwavering. "This is the story of every person who has been silenced. Every person who didn't have a courtroom full of witnesses. Every person who never got to hear the words not guilty." A hush settled over the crowd. "The system didn't fail today," she continued. "But it has failed too many times before, and it will keep failing unless we make it change." Nathaniel watched her, standing at the courthouse steps, more than just a defendant who had been exonerated. She was a force, a symbol, a movement waiting to happen. Because justice wasn't just a verdict. It was what came next. Justice is a fight, not a verdict. Later that evening, Nathaniel Vaughn found Olivia Carter standing on the rooftop of a quiet downtown building, staring out over the city. Atlanta's skyline stretched before them, its lights flickering against the night sky, casting reflections in the Chattahoochee River below. It was peaceful for a day that had been a battleground. Nathaniel sighed, stepping up beside her. "You should be celebrating." Olivia didn't turn. She exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the crisp night air. "Winning isn't the same as justice, Nathaniel." He frowned. "You were found not guilty. The truth came out. If that's not justice, what is?" Olivia finally met his gaze. "Justice isn't a courtroom decision, it's what happens after. It's making sure no one else has to sit where I sat. Making sure people like Callaway can't hide behind their badge and a lie." Nathaniel swallowed. He had spent years studying the law, believing that the truth would always win in the end. But today, watching Olivia, he realized something. The truth doesn't win on its own. Someone has to fight for it. "So what now?" he asked. Olivia looked back at the city, her expression unreadable. "Now," a faint smirk touched her lips. "Now, we make sure the system can't ignore the truth anymore." Nathaniel chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't stop, do you?" Her gaze hardened. "I can't afford to." Because the real fight wasn't over. The system had been exposed, but exposure wasn't enough. Change only came when people demanded it. And Olivia Carter, she wasn't done fighting. She was just getting started.